heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you, only you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. You give life, you are love, you bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. Great are you. The earth will shout your praise, our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. And all the earth will shout your praise, our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Are you, Lord? And all the earth, and all the earth will shout your praise, our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, we pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, we pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only, Lord. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. You are my vision, O King of my heart. Nothing There's only you, Lord. You are my best thought, my day or night. Waking or sleeping, your presence, my life. You are my wisdom, you are my true worth. I ever with you and you with me, Lord. You're my great Father, and I'm your true Son. You dwell inside me, together we're one. You are my battle, shield sword for the fight. You are my dignity, you're my delight. You're my soul shelter, and you're my house. Come raise me heavenward, oh power of my power. Oh, I don't want riches or man's empty praise. You're my inheritance now and old days. You and you only, that's in my heart. I King of heaven, my treasure you are. I King of heaven, when victory's won, may I reach heaven's joy, your bright heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, forever be my vision, O ruler of all. Heart of my own heart, will ever be, still be my vision, O ruler of all.
Okay, thanks very much to the band. Please do take a seat. Right, well, Andy's going to be speaking to us in a moment, but I thought first of all, let's get to know him. So Andy, come and join me up here. You use that one? You go there. So Andy, we worked together many years ago at Tear
Very
Fund.
long time.
Yes, great memories of that when you were Director of Advocacy there. And I always remember you were great at getting lots of organisations together for big campaigns. Right the way, because I joined not long before Make Poverty History.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And you were behind, who remembers Make Poverty History? Yeah, 2005, was it?
2005.
Yeah, and you're even up on the main stage, I remember.
I was famously up on the main stage. I was giving the big send-off to 250,000 people marching through Edinburgh, and I held the Tear Fund poster the wrong way round. You can imagine what the fundraising guys thought of me.
It's never forgotten that. Until you mentioned that, Andy, you'll be pleased to know I'd forgotten all about that. I just remember the quality of your presentation. So Andy, so how did you get into all of this? As a Christian, as an environmentalist, how did you get into it?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been asked that often, and I started off by saying, well, I studied geography and I became aware of all these problems. Actually, I think that's rubbish. I think it began in childhood. My parents were missionaries in the far, far north of Australia, between Papua New Guinea and the mainland of Australia. And we lived in the most incredible environment. At the same time, I remember dinner time conversation, my dad arguing with the authorities down south. They were trying to create apartheid in North Queensland, and we lived among the indigenous people. So my dad was always in battle with the government authorities for the rights of the people where we lived. Hey presto, I grew up as an environmental campaigner. I think it has much more to do with the witness of my parents than what I just regarded as normal as a child, that you're surrounded by a beautiful place, and people live there, and they've got rights too, and you need to defend both. You need to defend all of God's creation. And that was, now my dad would not say he's political. He would say, I would say he's completely apolitical. He just thought it was the right thing to do.
Just cared about the issues.
Yeah.
Cared about the people.
Yeah. So I think it probably has much more to do with that in reality. As I've got older and thought about it, I thought, actually, that's where it all comes from.
Yeah. And Hurricane Mitch, was that quite formative?
That was very formative, yeah, well remembered. So my first field trip as Tear Fund was I was sent to Honduras in Central America shortly after Hurricane Mitch struck. Some of you may remember that, 1998. At the time, it was the biggest hurricane the world had ever seen and did such damage, 60,000 people killed in the area and so on. So I was sent in to see what we could do about it. But they said, the scientists said, it's the biggest one we've ever seen, but if we don't stop what we're doing, this will become normal. And it has now become normal, 20 years later. You know, the speed at which climate change is accelerating environmental disruption, all the consequences for people is just horrific. So that was what led me, in fact, to set up the climate change program at Tear Fund. I came back and thought, guys, we've got to do something. So it became the first, I think, Christian development organization to formally start working on climate change because of its impacts on people.
Okay, fantastic. It's great to hear that story. And so bring us up to date. Tell us about your current role, about A Rocha. A lot of this, I haven't kept up with Andy recently, so it'd be great to hear.
Yeah, so I left Tear Fund to head up Friends of the Earth, in fact, for 7 years. So I think it was the first Christian heading up a big secular campaigning organization, which was tough, but rewarding at the same time. Then I really felt called to come back to work with Christians and churches, and went to A Rocha UK. A Rocha is an international network, and I run the UK bit. And what we do is, we started off doing practical nature conservation in a very poor part of West London, in fact. And we still do nature conservation. We have a couple of nature reserves, and we now have a growing network of Christians who manage land, Christian conference centres, retreat centres, a couple of cathedrals who have land that they wish to manage for nature and cutting carbon. So since the early days of A Rocha UK, what we've been doing is very much trying to facilitate Christians and churches doing this for themselves, not just doing it ourselves and saying, please give us some money to do a little bit, but actually helping everybody to do what they can do. So that's where Eco Church come from as well. We launched Eco Church 6 years ago now to facilitate churches doing this, and you're very much part of that, as we know, which is great. And we have something called the Wild Christian Scheme, which is as it sounds. It's helping Christians to enjoy the wildness of God's nature, but also to act together on it for nature and climate and people. So that's now what we're doing. Eco Church is by far the best known, but actually we do a number of other things. We're still a very small charity and rely on supporters like you to keep us going. But our aim is now not to do it all ourselves, but very much to facilitate others doing it for the biggest impact we can have together, and for the biggest witness we can have together as Christians, doing this locally and nationally, which we believe will be really good for the church as well. And that's a good thing, as well as good for nature and good for people.
And it's been fantastic the way Eco Church has resourced us as a church to turn our attention to these important matters. So, Andy, you've come equipped to present us with our Bronze Award. Steve, would you like to come and receive it as our lead minister?
Give me somebody official to give this to.
Yeah, not me. I don't care. So this is the result of great hard work by all sorts of people across the whole church. All right.
Steve, it gives me very great pleasure to give you this. Thank you very much. Well done. I know you're working hard. I'm sure this has been the work of many, many people, but it takes leadership, it takes blessing from on high very often to get things going. I shouldn't say that about this church.
You're referring to God there, were you?
Anyway, I very much look forward to coming back and giving you your silver. How should we say, 9 months, a year?
Well, yes, give us a target there. That's great. Well, and the other, great. And the great, just to say, Steve, before you go, so I don't know whether you remember last year when we launched our efforts to get the Bronze Award, I tried to encourage us by saying that St Nick's across the road had got their Bronze Award already. So it wasn't a competition, of course, but we should get our skates on. Wonderful to have Val and Margaret, of course, with us this morning from St Nick's. But they tell me they've now got their silver award already. So there we are. We still got to keep running. You're working. Oh,
good.
We'll have to keep running. Anyway, thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Right, Andy, I'll leave it over to you.
I'm just going to nip over there, get some water and my...
All right.
As a little aside, when we first launched Eco Church, we launched it in St Paul's Cathedral. And actually, we'd arranged for them to actually be doing pretty well, enough to be getting bronze the moment we announced it. So the moment we announced that St Paul's was getting bronze, York Cathedral said, right, beat you to silver. And they did. They did. So we weren't, it's kind of interesting, this award thing, and I'll say more about that. But some of us like competition, some don't. But for those who do, that's working. And let me just say that. Right, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. It's really good to be back working with Ian. We did a lot of good stuff together, had a lot of fun together at Tier Fund, though it was a while ago now, so it's great to be reunited, but good to see you. I don't live very far away. I live up the road in Thames Ditton, so right on the edge of London, but only 22 minutes, according to the map this morning. Let me start off with a bit of citizen science, if I may. So can I ask you to put your hand up and keep it up until I say so, if you've ever done one of a very short list of things. It's not embarrassing. I don't think it's embarrassing. So put your hands up if you've ever admired a breathtaking sunset. Oh, man, I don't really need to ask the rest of the questions, but, in case there are a few stragglers, keep them up, please. Have you ever sniffed a flower? That's not embarrassing, is it? I sniff flowers all the time. Have you ever smiled at the boldness of a robin accompanying you in the garden? Has anybody ever spoken to a robin? Okay, that's just about everybody. If you didn't have your hand up, come and speak to me. We may need to have a chat. Okay, that's just about everybody. And I know we all like to be a bit different. I've got terrible news for you this morning. You're absolutely normal. You're absolutely normal. We are wired as Christians to respond to nature. And scientists have now found the bit in our brain that actually reacts. And it calms us down. Unless it's a grizzly bear running towards you on a track, generally speaking, it calms you down. And that's really good. We are wired to respond to nature. It helps us make better decisions. It's good for us in all sorts of ways. And didn't we discover during the lockdown how essential it was? Certainly the little scrappy piece of wood near me on the edge of Surbiton became a kind of lifeline in that period where we were only allowed out for an hour. Absolute lifeline. So the science has also backed that up, how much we need contact with nature to thrive. We may all be wired to respond to the nature in front of our eyes on our cycle ride in the morning and so on. But at a planetary level, we're badly messing it up, aren't we? So what's going wrong? We're driving species to extinction. We're destabilizing the climate with terrible implications for ourselves now and future generations. And over the years, the church has rightly been very, very good at preaching reconciliation with God through Jesus Christ. And through that reconciliation with God, also reconciliation with other humans. Absolutely right. But the church has generally not been as good at preaching reconciliation through Jesus Christ with the rest of all of God's creation. And it's that lack of reconciliation with the rest of God's creation which is causing the problems we've now got. We'll all be mindful of terrible things happening in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and so on, horrendous, which we must respond to, and churches are responding very well to. But actually, what's happening there only emphasizes the need to do more and faster on climate change. For one thing, as we know, it's really disrupted fossil fuel supplies. It's really disrupted energy supplies. The answer to that is get off fossil fuel. Get onto renewable energy so you're not dependent on rogue states that will use energy as a weapon. It's exactly the same thing we need to do for climate change anyway. So actually there are incredibly significant implications of Ukraine actually for what we need to do on climate change. They are linked, believe it or not. Anyway, I will talk very briefly this morning about the biblical basis for responding to climate change, but I know you've done a lot on that before, so I'll be quite brief there. I'll then go on to talk about the causes and solutions to climate change. I think that's the most important thing in a way. And then to look at what we as Christians and churches could do about it. And I do believe we have a unique role as Christians and churches on this issue, which I want to spend most of my time unpacking this morning. Then I'll end with some ideas on what we can do. I feel the Lambert family have actually done half of that bit for me, which is actually very helpful. I can probably keep it a bit shorter, but well done, you guys. So let me start off with what the Bible has to say about God's view of the environment and his expectation of us. Now, I can be very brief here. You can kind of sum this up in two short ways. One, we are commanded to care for God's creation because he loves it. Because he loves it. And there's this wonderful passage in Genesis that doesn't often get read out. After God created it, everything, brought everything to life, God looked at it, looked at all that he had made, and saw that it was very good. And then it goes on to say, the Lord God took man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. In other words, God made it, God loves it, he wants us to benefit from it. We survive off the gifts of his creation, food, air, water. We couldn't live without them. But we are expected to take care of it. And that's what we need to focus much, much more on, much more urgently. Now, the second reason we have to care for the environment is that we are commanded to love our neighbour, the poor and the vulnerable. That was the whole point of that story of the Good Samaritan, which we will all remember, helping the poor and the vulnerable among us. And what we now know, of course, is that climate change is rapidly damaging the lives and livelihoods of millions of people around the world, including, in fact, in this country. If you live in a flood-prone area of this country, you are going to be more and more vulnerable. If you are poor and live in a flood-prone area, you won't be able to get insurance. So what are you going to do? So it's always the poor and the vulnerable that are most at risk from these things. So, in short, we have a double mandate as Christians to care for the environment. Actually, we have a double mandate as humans. God was talking to humanity when, in Genesis, he lays out what he expects of us. But as Christians, as followers of God, overtly, we should be the ones that are leading the way. So I think that's an honor that we have that responsibility. We can use the gifts of his creation, but we have a responsibility to care for it. It's an honor and something we should really enjoy. And we've been talking here this morning about how much we've all enjoyed nature. So that needs to motivate us. And I think we should be motivated more by the love of what God gives us than the fear of if we lose it. Fear causes us to despair, to close down. Let's be motivated by love. And that will get us much further, I think. So let me now look at the causes of climate change. Now, for those who are scientists, you'll know all this. For those who aren't scientists, let me give you the briefest summary. This is very short. I was not well behaved in science lessons at school. Okay, so I want to keep it short too. Very briefly. First of all, we've always had climate change. There's always been naturally occurring climate change. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had ice ages, would we? And we all know about those. So it is true when you hear people say, but we've always had changes in climate. Absolutely true. The problem is that was infinitesimally small changes over a very long period of time due to a number of astrophysical things I can tell you about later. What the Earth is experiencing now is completely different. It's not the same thing. It's happening now in the pace and in the depth that it's happening, largely because of fossil fuels. Basically, since the time of the Industrial Revolution, we've been burning increasing quantities of oil, gas, coal, and we've benefited hugely from it. Our societies have grown up on it. What they didn't know at the start of the Industrial Revolution, but we do know now, is that it's changing the balance of gases in the atmosphere so that we are trapping more and more heat from the sun within our atmosphere like a giant greenhouse and rapidly warming ourselves up so fast that we are destabilizing the whole climate system, which has given us the equable climate, the temperature ranges that have allowed civilization for the last 10,000 years. Without that equable climate, you would not have had what we now have. But we are now imperiling it all by the pace at which we are changing the atmosphere because of those particular gases. We know what the gases are. They call them, oddly enough, greenhouse gases because they're effect of heating us up. And they are things like carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, methane in particular, and a few more. We know what they are. We know where they come from. And that's kind of helpful because it means we know what we have to do. It's also important to say, though, that since we started putting loads of fossil fuels into the atmosphere, we are doing other things that make it worse. Secondly, after fossil fuels is clearing land, clearing our forests that we love so much, our grasslands, our wetlands, our marshes, usually for agriculture, increasingly for livestock in parts of the world like Brazil, but also in Europe, in America too, cutting down forests to grow livestock, to graze. And then the livestock themselves, I don't know if I can say this in church, but they give off a lot of wind. What is wind? Wind is methane. It's one of the most powerful greenhouse gases. So the more the world wants to eat meat, it's not just the effect of cutting down the forests that have stored carbon for millennia, it's the fact that the things you're putting there instead, cattle and sheep, are giving off huge quantities in their wind. That's the reality. So, scientists are very clear about the cause. I'm being as clear as I can be about the causes. What about some of the solutions? And it's great they're clear about the cause because it does give us a clue as to what we can do about it. I want to talk about three. I'll mention a fourth thing here. First of all, we need to get off fossil fuels. If that is where most of the greenhouse gases are coming from, the obvious thing to do is get off fossil fuels powering our economy as fast as we can and onto renewable energy. That's wind, solar, tidal, etc. The second thing we need to do is to shift away from that unbalanced diet. We eat an incredibly unbalanced diet generally in the West of the world. We are not healthy eating as much meat as we eat. So for our own health, as well as for the climate, moving to a more balanced diet with much more plant-based food would be much, much better for it. The third thing we need to do is to stop destroying the carbon sink, stop destroying what nature has provided, what God has provided to absorb those greenhouse gases. That is our forests, our grasslands, our wetlands, and so on. Fourthly, and I didn't mention this on the slide, it's moving away from that consumer culture. Because if now another source of greenhouse gases is all the factories, all the production, all the things that are made that we buy, we need to get those production processes off fossil fuels and off being so destructive, but we just need to buy less stuff we don't need, frankly. That would be a good thing to do. Now, that may sound very hard. I heard, I've forgotten your name, is it Phil? Paul, saying some of these things are challenging, and they are. But there are also huge benefits from them that go beyond, frankly, saving the planet for future generations and our own children and grandchildren. The good news is we know what we need to do. We know what practical solutions are available. The biggest problem, frankly, is a political one. It's that the politicians and the businesses are not moving as fast towards this as we need them to go. And that says something about what we can do about it. But to give a good example, the UK, we've already got off all of our coal-fired power stations. We have the biggest installed capacity of wind power anywhere in the world, offshore wind power. And the prices, the cost of renewable energy is absolutely tumbling. So it's not difficult, theoretically, to do this. The problem is one of people's expectations and one of the political leadership and sometimes opposition to doing the right thing. More good news I want to share with you. Many of these things that we need to do are really good, as I've said, for other things we care about. So were we to get off fossil fuel in this country for driving our cars and so on, we would be helping to save at least 40 to 50,000 deaths a year, not from car accidents, but from air pollution. So did you know they reckon 40 to 50,000 people a year die in this country alone from air pollution, largely caused by fossil fuel pollutants, things coming out of our cars and our factories. A report came out last week from the WHO saying they think 9 million people a year globally die from air pollution, largely from fossil fuel pollution. Not entirely, but largely. So why would we not want to do this for our health, for the health of our children living in cities and so on? So there's a real opportunity here for humankind to love our neighbour, to do something for all the other things we care about, as well as for climate change, which I think really helps when it feels like a sacrifice. And I want to say to Paul, I grew up as a kid in North Australia, flying everywhere. I love flying. Absolutely love it. We've just had to stop. We've just had to stop for family reasons because we cannot look anymore at the consequences of it and live with our conscience of what that's going to do. It's really difficult for business. I understand that. There are challenges here. But alongside the fun stuff, there is some hard stuff. And I feel that personally growing up where I grew up, particularly in relation to flying. I'm going down to south of France next week for an A Rocha International Conference. I am training all the way and looking forward to that, just to slow down and not to have to keep passing through security checks. Right, but there is, alongside the good news, a very mighty challenge. This is the scary bit. I'm really sorry, but we need to grasp this. We need to move much, much, much faster as societies if we are going to avoid triggering climate catastrophe. It's not an if, but a when now. The scientific advice adopted by the 2015 Paris Climate Summit was to try to hold temperature change to no more than 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average, above what it was before the Industrial Revolution. But in their latest report, and all governments agreed that that's what we should do, okay? That's now 7 years ago. In their latest report, just last month, this is what they said. Limiting warming to around 1.5 degrees requires global greenhouse gas emissions to peak before 2025. That's less than 3 years away. And to be reduced by 43% by the end of this decade. At the same time, methane would also need to be reduced by about a third. So that's one particular greenhouse gas, methane, from the cattle and the sheep, and from cutting down forests also. Even if we do this, it is almost inevitable that we will now temporarily exceed this temperature threshold. But we could return to below it by the end of the century if we do the right things, implied. This is incredibly serious. And what are politicians doing in response to the Ukraine emergency? They're talking about drilling more oil wells in the North Sea, more coal mines. Exactly the wrong response. Which is why it's so important that we also speak as well as do and tell our politicians what we want them to do. I'll come back to that. So that's the scary bit. Now, in a Chris Whitty-like way, may I have the next slide? Let me talk about the good news. More good news. As we look, as a Rocha, as we look with others I work with at how the church and how Christians can do something about this, I'm increasingly convinced that we're in a unique position as a sector of society. Politicians need to do more, but they will do more if sections of society urge them to do more and do more themselves to demonstrate that we're willing to make those changes. And as I look at what Christians and churches can offer, it's incredible. So we have our relationship with the Creator through Jesus Christ. We can worship, we can pray, we can draw on that double mandate to care for this with confidence that that's what God wants us to do. Sorry, I've got a little average church from Britain up there in the picture. Then there's our buildings and our churchyard, tangible ways that we can cut carbon, that we can manage them for nature by managing our buildings and our churchyards or any other land we got access to in the community better. Then there's our national presence. So it's not just the odd church here and there. There are 50,000 self-defined churches in Britain, in every village, city, neighbourhood, etc. Can you imagine the impact, the huge potential, if we all were to start doing the right thing, not just cutting carbon, but the influence effect that would have on our local communities? And then there's our numbers. Depending on whose statistics you want to look at, there's probably 3 to 4 million regular churchgoers in this country. We're the biggest single body if we chose to act together among civil society. Then there's also our denominational financial investments, the land that the Church of England owns. There's our Christian politicians of all parties in Parliament, as well as 24 Anglican bishops in the House of Lords. The list goes on. The assets we can draw on, if we want to, as Christians and churches, is really huge. And I think we've been put here for this time. We've been put here for a load of other things as well, but given the scale of this global crisis and the fact that Christianity is all over the globe, here I've just been referring to the UK, but our assets are enormous if we can be obedient to God. So if even a quarter of us in this country started acting as if we believe the mandate we've got, acting, prepared to move on the basis of love for God's creation, but being prepared to challenge ourselves and to challenge others, but to demonstrate what's possible, I think it would have a transformative effect on the pace at which the UK itself is going. And we're starting to see some of that now. So there are almost 5,000 churches registered with EcoChurch in England and Wales. So you are part of a community that is fast growing. More than 1,200 have been awarded bronze or above. In fact, the first gold church was a Baptist church in Tring in Hertfordshire. We now have 25 gold awarded churches. All of the Anglican diocese, 42 I think, are signed up to become eco-dioceses. We are working with the Baptists on the Eco-Synod. I think that's correct. So this is really gathering pace now. And when churches work together, and when organisations like a Rocha work with others, we can have a huge impact. So Climate Sunday campaign, which we worked on last year, saw 2,200 churches doing a Climate Sunday service and calling upon the government to do more. So Christians and churches are moving. That's good news. I think we all have a honour, I think, to ask God, what can we do more for him in this area? So how can a Rocha help? Well, the first thing I would say is, you know where you've got to as a church, and you can look on the survey of EcoChurch and see what else you can do. But I think the most effective way we will go further and faster as churches is by working with others and by sharing our own lessons, sharing our victories as well as our difficulties, sharing our lessons. And EcoChurch enables you to do that. So if you haven't already discovered the joys of the EcoChurch website, there are all sorts of resources on there, but we are now bringing in prayer forums, we're bringing in webinars on different issues and so on, really so that we can share among ourselves the lessons we're learning. Tring Baptist Church, for example, has insulated the church. It's switched to a green energy provider. It's committed to taking all of its investments out of fossil fuel companies. Oadby Baptist Church, which recently got bronze, has developed a small plot of land behind the church as a community garden to be a blessing to local people and to wildlife and to enable their outreach. St John the Baptist Church in Leytonstone, which got a silver in March, has started campaigning on climate change, including hosting an event in their churchyard with speakers, stalls, letter writing to MPs and so on. There are no end of things that you can usefully do. I can't possibly list them all here. But the best thing I can recommend is not just keep going with EcoChurch, but really use the fact that EcoChurch is going way beyond an award scheme now to be a community, a learning community where we can share with each other, pray with each other about how to go forward faster with this big challenge. Next slide, please. And if you're an individual and a household, as I say, the Lambert family have done us proud here with some great examples of what you can do. Switching to a renewable energy provider. My wife did it for us about 4 years ago now. We actually saved money. So it wasn't just a good thing to do. It was much, much cheaper than actually the fossil fuel energy versions. Okay, so you can do that online in 45 minutes. Reducing your fossil fuel in your transport. Again, walking, cycling for short journeys. Many people still can't afford an electric car. If you can, fabulous. But actually, it still takes a lot of energy to make that. If you're driving your electric car down to the shops 500 yards away, actually, is that a good idea? So for most people, there's other things you can do long before you have to pay out for an electric car. But we also should be asking the government to make things like that more accessible to everybody. A more balanced diet we've talked about. And then lastly, I would say something that is entirely free for all of us, which is using our voice, as I've said. The problem here is not that we do not know what to do. It's not that the governments don't understand what the problem is. It's their fear of the public reaction if they move as fast as actually we need to move. So you and I saying to our MP, you and I joining online campaigns to go, yes, we are for the UK moving much faster in climate change, will help. And it's free. We don't have to pay a penny to do that, to go online and add our voice to those things. And that, I believe, will make the biggest single difference to the pace at which we move when bodies of people like Christians stand up and say to our elected representatives, you need to move faster. And that so matters to us. It will affect what we buy, what we do in our own homes, how we travel. It will also affect how we vote. That will make the biggest difference. So just as in churches, we can benefit from a community like Eco Church, while Christian, that Arosha has set up, is trying to be a community for individuals and households. We've heard some of the things you can practically do, but we want people to be able to share and pray and learn and enjoy nature together as part of it. So it's set up to be something that enables you to enjoy nature, have fun together, as well as do those practical things. And if you want to do more about that, you can just sign up outside. It's free on the sheet. We won't bug you for money. It's a service we're providing for Christians and churches in their own homes. So I'll end now. I've given you a lot to think about, I'm sure. Some of it's scary, but I think as Christians we have to face the scary stuff. But I also think we need to grasp what I do believe is a unique role we have been given for these times as Christians and churches. And we see the churches increasingly playing that role. Don't forget to keep praying, to keep enjoying God's nature, and to keep praising Him and worshipping as we are doing today. Our actions have to be based on our relationship with God. But let that relationship with God, the Creator, drive us much, much faster to care for the rest of His creation. And I believe not only is that the right thing to do, but we will see many, many benefits of it for ourselves now, not just in terms of long-term climate change. Go back to that flying thing. I really miss flying, but I've really got into long train journeys. I can sketch from them. I see all sorts of stuff out the window you just can't see from a plane. So I give that as an example of when you do the right thing, you will find all sorts of benefits that you never dreamt of. And I believe that will be the same for us in responding to God's creation on those difficult bits. There's loads of good bits we already know about. And I look forward to coming back in a time frame you will decide to present you with silver. Thank you.
Let's stand. Lord bless you and keep you. Make His face shine upon you. Be gracious to you. Lord, turn His face towards his face shine upon you, be gracious to you. Lord, turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen. 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 Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you, and be gracious. Lord turn his face towards you and give you Amen. Amen. His favor be upon you in 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and your children, and your children. His favor be upon you in 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and your children, and their children. His favor be upon you in 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and your children, and your children. His favor be upon you in 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and your children, and your children. May his presence
So if you'd like to take a seat, thank you to Dan and the band for some wonderful worship this morning. Thank you to Andy for a fantastic talk, clear, passionate, challenging. Thank you. We'll have a blessing in a moment, but just to say, do stay behind afterwards and have a cup of coffee and mingle. In the foyer, Andy will be there, and I will be there with Andy. There's some resources that you might like to take away with you, and Andy will be staying for a while, so please do collar Andy and ask him anything you'd like about A Rocha and the bigger issues. And also, fantastic, in the foyer today, we have Jeannie's got some crafts there to sell to raise money for the Ukraine support group. So do have a look at that on your way out as well. Let's finish with a blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. And as we go out into the world this week, may the Lord help us to be the best stewards of his creation we can be. Amen.